Hey there, Sterile Processing Universe. Welcome back to another episode of Sterile Horizons, Advancing ASC Excellence. This is a special Beyond Clean podcast series sponsored by Solventum. I'm your host, Bobbie Parker, and in this series, our aim is to detail some of the challenges and opportunities that come along when you reprocess instruments in the ASC so that you can provide the best quality of care possible for your patients, every instrument, every time. On today's episode, get ready because we're going to be interviewing Sterile Processing Director of ASCs, Bobbie Gaskins. So you're about to listen to the Bobbie and Bobbie show. We're interviewing Bobbie because of her experience from an operational side of things, managing ASCs, and I'm going to be asking her how to deal with the logistical challenges of keeping up with the needs of the OR when you have an ASC-sized surgical instrument inventory. How do you meet those needs and manage the communication around instrument turnovers? And then maybe more than that, as a leader, how do you go about the process of justifying the purchase of additional instruments and navigating the financial constraints or the storage constraints that you have in an ASC? So I'm looking forward to this interview because I know that Bobbie's had a lot of success in these areas in recent years. And so looking forward to hearing some of the wisdom that she has to share with us. So we'll be right back with Bobbie Gaskins after this short break. And joining us now in studio is Bobbie Gaskins, Director of Sterile Processing for Main Campus and Ambulatory Surgery Centers out at Cleveland Clinic. Bobbie, it's been a while since we've connected. It's good to have you back on the show. Good to talk to you again.
It's good to be here. Thank you, guys. I am super excited to dive into this topic. It's close to my heart, and I think ambulatory surgery is going to continue to grow. So, important topic.
Yeah, I certainly agree. And that's part of what made me think about you, Bobbie, when we were talking about doing a series on ASCs, because I know that's been a big part of your story. So for those who aren't familiar with you, why don't you get us started by introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about that ASC background, why this is an important topic?
Awesome. So I've been doing sterile processing since high school. I went to a trade school in Cincinnati. It had a surgical tech background, but also taught you the sterile processing piece, and graduated certified and immediately went into sterile processing. I've worked as a technician, as a lead technician, a supervisor, a manager, and now currently director. I was manager of our ambulatory surgery centers here in the Cleveland Clinic. So 5 locations spread throughout Cleveland, a lot of traveling, a lot of different cultures and dynamics and OR teams that you have to find a way to bring together and make feel like one team. And so I feel like I did a good job of that, and now, promote it into the director of those facilities and able to, strategically align them even more than I already have. And so currently I am managing or director of those ambulatory surgery centers and main campus down here in downtown Cleveland.
Yeah, well, thanks for that background. I'm sure, having been in a number of different ASCs, both as a technician and then in your experience leading, you've seen a lot of things that work and don't work, and wrestled with a lot of the logistical challenges that come along with being the reprocessing team in a small department. And that's really the topic that I want to get into today is the logistics side of running a sterile processing department in an ASC, particularly around instrument inventory, but like how do you get by without having enough instruments to go around? And maybe that's a little bit easier when you're part of a big network. I don't know. Maybe you borrowed some from one another, but then that also creates logistical challenges of offsite stuff. So excited to see where all this conversation takes us. But let's kind of get started here at the level of definitions. Why don't you persuade us real quickly that it is uniquely challenging to do logistics in an ASC? Like, what are some of those struggles that you've run into?
Yeah, so I think, first and foremost, ambulatory surgery centers, they run lean. They run lean from the equipment that they have to the instrumentation, storage. And so, on top of that, having a high case turnover and possibly occasionally loaner and vendor discrepancies of not delivering things on time, and then smaller facility, smaller budget. So all of those create challenges and, you have to be creative. And so that's what we've done in our ambulatory surgery centers, is not only be creative, but also justifying what we need. So that's been my journey when I took over, is identifying what, are the implications, how can we justify it and get what we need.
Sure. Well, I think I'll leave it at that, because I'm sure we don't need to spend too much time trying to persuade people that it's hard running an SPT in the ASC. And throughout this series, those same topics of budget constraints, particularly space constraints, is the one we've been really hammering on, of the Deacon Tam closet, where there's just nowhere to put instruments as you're cleaning them. And then, budget, space, and then also instruments have come up. And I really want to get more into that instrument conversation in today's interview, because that's just as important as having enough space to be able to clean them appropriately. Like, there's all kinds of downstream implications of not having enough inventory to be able to get through even today's cases of the number that they scheduled, and dealing with turnarounds and things. So what are some of those implications you've had to deal with having a really lean surgical instrument inventory in your departments?
I think my teams have always been focused on patient safety and getting the job done. I don't know they always had that person that was escalating the surgeon frustration when things don't go right, that was escalating, the culture and the caregiver frustration of being in that state of turnover and feeling like you can't step away, because if you do, you're not going to get the tray turned over. And they're small, lean teams too. So while it looks like it's a smaller facility, the stress can feel big when you don't have team members to fall back on. And so, patient safety risks are always there. I don't think my team took shortcuts and put patients at risk. They, I think, more so took on that burden to get the job done. And that means maybe neglecting a break, or, staying late and doing overtime to make sure all of the trays that were used today are back up for tomorrow. And a lot of larger scale facilities don't deal with that. Oh, everything that was used today, we need again for tomorrow. And so, that creates cultural issues, that creates burnout. And I'm sure there's shortcuts that I haven't seen that take place. When I'm there, they're on their P's and Q's. But prior to getting the resources that we had, it was tough.
Yeah. Well, that shortcuts conversation, you started off by talking about it having patient safety implications. And those cultural implications of working late into the evening, mandatory overtime, skipped breaks, things like that, those are patient safety implications, because soon enough, those employees aren't going to be there any longer. And then there's nobody to process the instruments. So yeah, it absolutely does trickle downstream. We talked about, turning instruments over, particularly for the same day. Now, in the hospital environment that I grew my sterile processing roots, I don't know what kind of illustration that was, but where I gained my sterile processing experience, we tried as hard as we could not to put our team in a situation where we were reusing the same instrument tray multiple times in a day. We called those a turnover, and we tracked them really carefully in the tracking system. And then when we saw any trends where this is happening with any degree of frequency, we were working on buying a replacement set. Is that kind of mindset in an ASC a reality, or were there certain kinds of instrument trays where we just do so many of these little cases, we're just going to plan as part of the workflow that we're going to turn the first cataract set over for the last one, or whatever the instrument tray was?
I think it's very site specific, but I think it's also, circumstance and its service line. So for example, we worked to up our cataracts to have enough to get through every single case plus some, and that's a recommendation per Amy. And so for me, when I'm justifying getting enough trays to get through the cases, which is the goal ultimately, I'm looking back at, regulatory alignment, surgeon satisfaction, operational efficiency, and then the risk mitigation, and trying to tie that investment directly back to reduce patient safety risk. But sometimes you run into circumstances where you don't have enough space. And so I was able to up my ophthalmology to 40 plus trays. They're small, they don't take up much space. But when I look at my ambulatory surgery center that started doing total joints, for example, I'm not able to get as much inventory as I need. And it's also offsite reprocessing. So that's a game of vendors having to support with backup, making sure the items are going to those offsite processing centers because we can't house everything on site. And then you have your just general smaller same day surgeries as well. And if I can fit it, I'm trying to get enough trays to get through everything. It's tying in that space piece. And if you don't have the space, then you are going to be in a state of turnover. And so it really depends.
Yeah, for sure. I want to give you an opportunity to expand on the ophthalmology decision a little more. You mentioned an Amy recommendation, and that's why I use cataract as my example, because I'm with you. I don't think we should be turning eye trays over. Could you expand a little bit on that for why ASCs that are currently turning their eye instruments need to start that justification process today?
Yeah, for us, it was really digging into the IFU of reprocessing and how much time does it take to do these trays. And so, once we really polished our process and we realized like, okay, it takes, 10 minutes soaking for manual clean, 10 minutes for the ultrasonic clean, 10 minutes to rinse it and the DI water. It's a 30-minute process and we don't have enough trays, even if we, didn't want to have to purchase and invest. If we're going to follow the IFU and follow this process, we have to increase. So that really governed our decision, is digging into the IFU, digging into the regulatory requirements, and then holding ourselves accountable to have those conversations with the clinicians, with the operational stakeholders, finance, and justifying it. And I mean, ultimately we did, and we were able to up our ophthalmology from having 27 trays to 40 trays. And now we are set up for not only 1 day, but 2 days of having enough sterile inventory. And it just takes that pressure off. It allows the team to take the time that they need to follow the recommendations and the manufacturer's instructions for use without feeling pressure of impacting patient care.
Yeah, I think that's really wise. Anytime we set a high standard of something that needs to happen, particularly a process change in the department, before we implement it, we've got to make sure that people are given the tools they need to succeed. And one of those tools is time. We've got to make sure that we're not asking them to do a really long process, but physically there just isn't time to achieve that. And so then they're having to go through the moral injury of deciding whether or not they're going to follow the practice that the manager insisted we put in place, or and bear the wrath of the OR, or in self-preservation trying to make the OR happy. And we definitely don't want to put people in that kind of situation. So yeah, fencing the decontam time around those ophthalmology instruments really important. Okay, so the other example that you gave was your facility that was doing ortho trays, and you mentioned having some offsite worked into their storage space constraints. Could you tell me a little bit more about that offsite relationship? Like what's getting processed locally, what's getting sent offsite, and how did you decide those kind of inventory considerations?
Yeah, so, that facility doing the total joint program also has a very heavy ophthalmology service line, and it's a very small decontam. And so, walking the space, talking to subject matter experts and my team, we pretty quickly identified this is going to be a, service of excellence for ophthalmology on site. And in order to keep that going and not impact ophthalmology reprocessing, we have to look outside of our own four walls. And so, the Cleveland Clinic is a large enterprise, and there's regional hospitals close by to our ambulatory networks. So partnering with the regional facilities close by, we decided we would keep the general stringer instrumentation on site. We could handle that volume. What we could not handle was the copious amounts of vendor trays, and also the time that it takes to do those vendor trays if you're following the IFU and manufacturer's instructions. We didn't have enough sink space to even accomplish it. So that really was the governing piece. As we're too small, we don't have throughput. And partnered with the regional facility, not only through logistics, but timing. And, you have to get everything back at the right time. Storage is also another conversation. Some things live on site at Lorraine, while some things live on site at the other facility. And so it also ebbs and flows based on volume and case complexity. We're still growing that program and looking at how can we optimize it and be better each day.
Yeah, I think that's a wise decision. The conversation around ophthalmology in particular, and I didn't have any intention for this turning into the ophthalmology show, but it kind of has. It's an important consideration. You mentioned sync space, but also ultrasonic space, and the recommendation to have a dedicated ultrasonic for ophthalmology instruments, and the IFUs for those orthopedic loaners have in the cleaning instructions ultrasonic usage. And so, yeah, for the ASC that's struggling with decontam space, and we're rolling out this new orthopedic program, and we're doing ophthalmology, that is an important risk assessment to do on the front side of it. It's like, we only have space for one ultrasonic in this room, and here's this recommendation that says that we don't share this machine for these two different service lines. So definitely a sticky situation if you don't have that relationship on the outside to do the offsite reprocessing. I'm curious, have you ever worked in or been around an ASC that's adopted some of the orthopedic total joint procedures from the hospital, and they are processing them on site? Because that's been a topic of conversation through the series is, how do you get by with one washer, one tech, and get through these total joint trays?
I personally, I'm happy I haven't seen it. I mean, for me and my facilities, it was a very quick decision of, we're not moving this in, because exactly what you said, we have one washer, we have one sonic, and it's just not feasible. So personally, within the Cleveland Clinic, we are the only ambulatory facility doing total joints. We launched it in January, and it's been successful, and we've proven concept. So of course they want to grow it. But I've also, and I always do, advocate for my teams, advocate for patients, and make sure that all of the stakeholders are aware of sync space, ultrasonic. Like, they need to understand those risks. And a lot of the times, those stakeholders at the table, the executive tables, don't. And so I've made sure I have a seat at that table. I've made sure I advocate for my teams and the patients, and I'm open to being creative. I think we solve a lot of complex challenges here at the Cleveland Clinic, and it's utilizing our resources, being a team of teams, and relying on those regional facilities. You want to see growth, we'll make it happen, but here's how we have to go about it.
Right. Yeah. Have that infrastructure in place before we make the decision to roll it into a facility. One more question about this orthopedic loaner and vendor trays piece. So because you've got this consistent schedule of total joints, how much of those orthopedic loaners are you consigning to the process so that they live there and your technicians are doing it? And how much of it have you decided to have vendors come in and reset every time and kind of baby through the process with paperwork?
So right now, we, for our block allocation, do total joints 2 times a week. So Thursday and Tuesday. With that, we looked at inventory, looked at constraints, looked at throughput. How much are these surgeons planning on doing in a day is really what governed my decision. And so the physician stated they could do, up to 6 in a day. So with that, we said, okay, we get 4 sets that live in-house. And then if we need more, it's supported by vendor. And we could only fit 4 sets, so space also governed that decision. And so right now we own 4 total joint knees, 4 hips. They're robotic as well. So we have the manual and the robotic sets, which adds more trays. You're saving trays in the OR, but you have to have the manual set up in case the robot fails. So right now there's 4 hips, 4 knees, and then we rely on the vendors if they have more cases. And those are delivered to the offsite reprocessing center, or facility, you should say. It's really a regional hospital, but they offsite reprocess for us. And so we're making sure we're in constant contact with those vendors. We have a weekly touch base, and we also have that regional facility on the call so they know what to expect. And we hold them accountable for tight timelines. They must deliver within 24 to 48 hours. Really, 48 hours is the goal. Communication is key. From starting at the surgeon's office to the vendors to SPD, we must be aligned. And then we have really great documentation from Ready, Set, and SPM communicating with each other. And then that human factor as well of us just following up and making phone calls and having good relationships with our vendors.
It's funny you brought up the policy and process for getting loaner trays brought into the facility, because everybody struggles with that, getting them there on time, and that 24 to 48 hour window is usually what you see. I was curious if you all had to stretch that even further, dealing with the offsite portion of it. But I suppose if you've got a good communication process, like you said, they'll make it there on time. Well,
and thankfully, to expand on that, we're not dealing with trauma add-ons, and the criteria for those patients in the ambulatory setting, it's very rigorous. So they're usually booked about a month out. So, from our nursing team, they send out an email about a month in advance, alerting the vendors, here's our total joint procedures that we have for the month of October. So we already know what we're looking at in October. Granted, it might change, but we have the vendors tagged in on that email thread. And that's been just a nice, consistent communication where we close the loop and we dot our I's and cross our T's. Still struggle with the delivery drop-offs. And what we run into is the vendors telling us, well, we don't have enough trays in our inventory in our warehouse. And I'm consistently fighting that battle still of, well, you guys committed to supporting us and supporting this offsite program. So how are we going to get you there? What do we need? Because we're growing. We want to do more. And so we're partnering with them currently on that of how can we help each other, because we're in this together. You guys want your trays here. We want the trays here. Everyone's trying to serve the patient. What do we need to do?
Yeah, I've had that conversation with some vendors in the past, and their suggested solution was, well, the hospital can just buy a system. Here's here's an invoice for $120,000 or however much. It's
I'll put it on the roof.
Yeah, it's that's
where it'll go.
That's right. So I don't know that that's the solution, but you're right that that vendor partnership's really important, and it's good to sometimes remember that it's not always that one individual rep's fault that they're always struggling to get there in time, because they're a little bit at the mercy of their local distributorship and the available inventory. But that also, like you said, doesn't mean that we just decide to live with it and say, well, there's just not enough in the region, so we'll just be processing emergency trays all the time. I wanted to circle back to the conversation around justifying inventory, because we touched on it and moved on pretty quickly. You talked about considerations for space, and that's certainly one of them. But often the bigger consideration for a leader dealing with an ASC is trying to make consideration for the financial piece of it. So for the leader out there who knows that they need another, stringer set for ortho, or they know that they need some more of the ophthalmology instruments, what advice would you give them for making that case to justify purchasing some additional instruments?
Quality costs money. And so if you have caregivers that are rushing and you're having a high error rate because of that, that's one area that you can highlight and say, reprocessing costs more money. And so if we have the time to do it right the first time, it's going to save us on the back end. So I've had those conversations quite frequently. Fewer turnover equals, more cases per day. You can grow and you can do more and you can extend your block time if you have the resources available. And then my real I think what has really pushed me forward and helped me get what I need has been surgeon satisfaction and in partnering with the clinical teams. I make time to round in my ORs and talk to the surgeons and build those relationships. And, sooner or later, they start asking you, do you have what you need? Is there anything that we can help advocate for? And so for the total joint program, I partnered with, multiple different physicians to be an advocate, to understand what is going on down there in sterile processing and how if we have what we need, you will have what you need. And so, those relationships have been, I would say 75% of my success, the work of documentation and having trends and being able to identify where we can optimize is a piece of it. But most of it is a human factor and being able to explain to those executive stakeholders the impact and how it's going to grow your surgical impacts and ultimately get you where you want to go. And you can't get there without us. And you can't just get there and forget about SPD. So like I said in the past, having a seat at that table and being able to paint a story for them and then they understand.
Yeah, that's really insightful, Bobbie. Often when we talk about how to justify costs, we go immediately to the conversation of, how to put together a good ROI or a good proposal and learning to speak the language of the C-suite and having some business sense about how we lead. And all of those things are very important. But what you just underlined about building a relationship with the OR and earning some trust and garnering support, those are topics that we don't spend enough time talking through. And as sterile processing leaders, perhaps don't spend enough time investing in. And so, yeah, I really appreciate that advice. Gosh, the time goes by so fast. This has been a really fun interview, Bobbie. I'm thankful that we got to touch on some of the unexpected topics that we did around ophthalmology and OR relationships. I certainly have more questions about ASC logistics, and I know the audience does as well. So if somebody wanted to get in touch with you and ask you some more details about any of the stories we touched on today, what would be the best way for them to get in touch with you?
So I am on LinkedIn. You can find me on LinkedIn under Bobbie Gaskins. I'm also a part of and president of our Northeast Ohio Central Service Association chapter. We're on LinkedIn as well. And so you can reach out to me on either of those platforms, and I would love to get in touch.
Love that. Well, thanks again, Bobbie, for joining us for the conversation today.
Thank you, guys. Have a great day.
And that was Bobbie Gaskins, Director of Sterile Processing out at Cleveland Clinic for their main campus and ASCs. And what a way to end the interview. That appeal to build a relationship with your OR in general and your surgeons specifically, and the impact that has operationally in your department, both from garnering a support, as Bobbie was talking about, but also it can really impact just the trust between the departments as you make decisions together around what instruments are going to be brought into the facility. When you're trying to optimize trays and remove instruments from trays, like having those pre-established relationships can really help. Even helps some with the quality perspective as you try to bring frontline technicians into those conversations in the OR, checking in after a case. Hey, how was your first case this morning? We've talked a little bit about that on Beyond Clean, and I'll say just from my personal experience reflecting as a sterile processing manager, that's something that I wish I would have spent more time doing, is going into the OR and speaking directly with surgeons, making sure that from a customer service perspective, they knew the person leading the sterile processing department, that they knew them by name and that we were concerned for them. Now, we did have the benefit of an OR liaison, and we've talked about that some on the show. If you look through the Beyond Clean podcast for that word OR liaison, we've talked about some of the cultural and customer service implications of having somebody dedicated to doing just that, of meeting the needs of the OR, understanding their wants and desires, communicating the challenges that we have, the challenges that they have, and kind of gluing the two departments together. So if you don't have one of those and you think that sounds like something worth exploring, I would encourage you to go listen to that episode. But yeah, the downstream impacts of having that relationship Absolutely massive. Well, really great conversation today around the logistics of running an ASC and the logistics of trying to manage sterile inventory when you don't have the space, when you don't have the money, when you don't have enough washers, ultrasonics, or sinks to be able to manage the inventory, and hopefully some solutions for you as we learn from Bobbie's experience. That's going to do it for today's episode. Until we talk to you again next time here on the show, we'll leave you as we always do here at Beyond Clean. Keep fighting dirty.